I think about how we create definitions for words, it always strikes me as insufficient. It's just as important, if not more important in some cases, to define what isn't included in the definition. The problem is that it's impractical to relate or negate an entire universe of possibilities for every definition, so we just kind of go with S knows P is true and we call it a day. Probably one of the best known examples of this is Plato defining man as a featherless biped. Diogenes the Cynic plucked a chicken and brought it to Plato's academy saying, "Behold, I've brought you a man." And so the academy added to the definition, "with broad flat nails." This is a good example of the kind of absurdities that can result by trying to create complex definitions without contrastive relations and direct negations. S knows that P is true under contrastivism only if S can rule out alternatives like not P or Q, where Q is some relevant alternative proposition. Contrastivism is a philosophical perspective that centers on the idea that the meaning of an expression or a proposition is best understood in terms of the contrasts it makes. In contrastive analysis, the emphasis is on relationships between alternatives or possibilities rather than individual elements in isolation. This approach is applied across various philosophical domains such as epistemology, semantics, ethics, and the philosophy of science. In epistemology, contrastivism redefines discussions about knowledge and justification by asking whether one knows a proposition compared to some contrastive alternative. This shifts the focus from absolute knowledge claims to comparative evaluations against alternatives. In linguistics and the philosophy of language, contrastivism is used to analyze certain expressions, particularly those involving contrastive focus, emphasizing one part of a sentence over another. In ethics, contrastivism considers moral judgments in relation to alternative actions or behaviors, moving beyond isolated evaluations. In the philosophy of science, it is applied to discussions about scientific theories and explanations, emphasizing the importance of considering alternatives for comprehensive understanding. Overall, contrastivism offers a nuanced and contextually sensitive approach to philosophical inquiry by exploring the relationships and distinctions between different possibilities. While contrastivism has its merits in providing a nuanced understanding of meaning and judgment by considering alternatives or contrasts, it's not without its criticisms. Some common critiques include overemphasis on contrast. Critics argue that contrastivism may place too much emphasis on contrasts, potentially overshadowing the intrinsic meaning of a statement or proposition. In certain cases, the contrastive element might be seen as adding unnecessary complexity without substantial benefits. Lack of clarity in application. Applying contrastivism may sometimes lead to ambiguity or lack of clarity in the specification of alternatives. Determining what counts as a relevant contrast can be subjective, and different interpretations may arise, making it challenging to apply consistently. Limited applicability. Some critics argue that contrastivism is not universally applicable and might be more suitable for specific philosophical domains, like epistemology and ethics. Its usefulness may depend on the context, and there could be situations where a non-contrastive approach is more appropriate. Potential for overgeneration. There is a concern that contrastivism may lead to an overgeneration of alternatives, making it difficult to manage the infinite possibilities of contrasts. This could undermine the practical utility of contrastivism in certain contexts. Complexity and cognitive load. Introducing contrastive elements might increase the cognitive load for understanding statements, especially in everyday communication. Critics argue that this added complexity can make discourse more challenging and less accessible. Challenge of defining relevant contrasts. Determining what counts as a relevant or appropriate contrast can be subjective and context dependent. Critics argue that this subjectivity might introduce difficulties in applying contrastivism consistently across different cases. Potential for distortion. In some cases, introducing a contrast might distort the original meaning or focus of a statement. Critics suggest that contrastivism, if not carefully applied, could lead to misinterpretations or misrepresentations of the intended message. Understanding how to contrast and negate alternatives to proposed definitions creates a needed contextual foundation that is relational and necessary to truly understanding the proposition. Just remember, when you're reading definitions of terms, that's the absolute minimum of contextual detail, and there's much more support context not being offered. If you like this kind of philosophical subject matter, help us out by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell.